Hello and welcome to Stampscaping 101, the second video. In the first video I went over kind of the general concept of the stamps in terms of the individual images being blended with one another and with themselves to form seamless scenes. And I just want to reinforce that with some different compositions here and to go over maybe some other variations using those same images. In the first video, I kind of did these three compositions right here, showing you largely based around the Lakeside Cove stamp right here. I showed you the full application of the design being used in its entirety, being used with itself in pieces, and right here going over just using bits and pieces of it to kind of create a real different look in terms of the application of that design. Let's go into a design like this, and I'll show you how you can really kind of dissect nature designs up a little bit more than just using them as kind of what they represent, again, in their entirety here. Now this design right here is called the Lakeside Cove Large, and it's largely Lakeside Cove because we can see the reflections down here, okay, in the water. And that's really the only thing that says that that's a kind of a water-based design. Now here's one of the things we can do. Okay, I've colored this stamp up here, and I didn't color too much of the water down here. In fact, I went down there a little bit into those reflections, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a paper towel and really wipe off some of those reflections. You can also kind of just be careful not to ink them up too much, to begin with. And I'll stamp this down here. I'll just kind of put it in the center of the card because I think I'm going to use a mountain in here to show kind of another little tweak on the impression part of these designs. But here it is right here, okay? Looks pretty different than this one right here. Again, I just took out those reflections right here so they don't really show up too much. In these scenes right over here that are water-based, I've used the water pattern small to create these, these other textures. Now that creates kind of a ripply textured surface here. There's nothing to say that you need that, though. You can have very calm, still water without using that. But just staying with the textures, additional textures, let's change up right here and go with something like this grass down here, okay? And just by changing that texture, changing that element, going from something water-based to something more land-based, I would use this in the same way, if you watched that last video, as the water pattern stamp. I'm overlapping the impressions, okay? And I'm building up this entire meadow area down here, okay? And there's nothing to say that that can't be a land-based image. And that's the same thing for something like this. This is called Pines and Rocks, and I don't know, we generally use that for water, but there's nothing to say, if you use something like this Sedge filler stamp, that can't be land. All right? And staying with that same type of foreground theme that we did on this one with these reeds. Again, you can kind of reiterate the idea of this grass. Maybe you're kind of now laying down in the grass, worm's eye view type of thing, or just maybe there's some larger grass clusters right there. You can be looking through these reeds into the scene, and maybe instead of doing something like a water-based focal point, let's say we're doing something like a deer or hikers or whatnot. And I can take this, I'm inking it up, I can place it in my scene right here. One of the things I like to do is if I have things with legs or whatever, that's being positioned into the grass, just to make it look like these images are kind of set in the grass a little bit more, I wipe off the bottom of their feet so it doesn't look like they're standing on something really hard, they're standing kind of within something. And kind of figure out the placement of it, wherever I want it to go. Maybe I'll kind of have this a little bit off center. And we have a little doe in there. Okay, now, as far as the blending of imagery, layering imagery, overlapping imagery off one another, these clouds are in the background here of that same Lakeside Cove large stamp. Let's say I wanted to go with something a little bit more solid. That cloud stamp right there is mostly tonal. It's for the most part, it's a gray tone. It's a bunch of little dots that have been used to create that, that texture and image. But let's say we're going with something like this that has, you know, there's a lot of texture down here, but there are some more solid patterns. So if I can just take this, ink it up, and stamp it right over those trees if I want to. Those trees are solid. You'll still be able to see the mountain in the background, and the mountain won't look as though it's in front of the trees. But let me show you a little technique right here that I like to do. It's really simple to do, just so you can see those trees. You can retain the shape and silhouette of those trees a little bit more. I can take this paper towel and really blot off. I don't want to go with a wet paper towel and take off everything and thus create a, you know, a separate, straight, hard line down there, but just kind of dab off some of this ink. I'm going up into about, I don't know, maybe 1 inch into this mountain stamp right here. Taking off a lot of the ink off the bottom portion of it, leaving the top portion a solid black. I guess you can take off some of that ink too if you want it to be more of a gray tone. But in this case, I'll just take off some off the bottom. And I'm guessing those trees, you know, are going up about something like that into the mountain image. Get good even pressure and take that. And you can see where it goes from a little bit more of a solid black to kind of a gray tone there. I don't know what that is, maybe 30% or something like that. And I feel that you can retain more of the shapes of those trees, and it's a little bit more apparent that way. Okay, so there's a variation on kind of this Lakeside Cove type of thing, changing it into a meadow just by changing the textures. Okay, now on something like this, I can also put, you know, some additional clouds. Maybe I'll do that. I can have it coming from behind the mountain, you know, or maybe I'll just keep things real simple and have these clouds coming in from over the top like that. I'm not worried about masking. I did overlap into those mountains a little bit. Now, when I say overlapping, I don't want to go in, you know, 3 inches into the, you know, stamp or something like that. But just in general, I wasn't being too careful about it. From one impression, I re-inked again, and then I came over here, and you can see where I've changed the angle slightly. That way it doesn't look like a bunch of bricks lining up perfectly with one another. And I'll go into sky images on a separate video because these are rectangular shapes, okay? Well, let me see. Maybe I can do that right here. I'll just give you the general concept of this cloud stamp right here, okay? And I'll go into it a little bit more in depth on another video. But what I'm doing right here is, I'll show you what not to do on something like this. What you don't want to do is you don't want to stamp out something like this cloud stamp and approach the layering or the matching up of imagery as though it's a jigsaw puzzle or something of that nature, where you're kind of lining things up perfectly. And that's the way a lot of times people use it, and it's completely understandable because a lot of times where people are using, they're coming from kind of a foundation of stamping where they've been using imagery that is, for the most part, outlines, and you don't want to have a bunch of outlines crisscrossing each other, so people are using things like stamp positioners, they're using masking films, masking tapes, post-it notes, etc. Okay? But that's generally what people do. So they try to match landscape imagery up too perfectly, okay? Okay, so that's an example of probably what you don't want to do unless you're going for something kind of a little bit more abstract and you want to create some kind of stacking effect for some odd reason. Okay, here's a cloud stamp used again, all right? Stamping on top of itself, changing the angle and going into the previous impression. Hopefully you can't see too much of a line. I mean, if I really look close and I know this design, I can see a line right there, but it's not really going to be a problem. Okay? This is where it's being stacked up. And talking about changing the angle, if I want to, I can change the angle to the extreme or something like this. I love using this cloud stamp right here. This is called the Cloud Cumulus. It's a really good filler stamp. And you can even kind of create, this area of light in there, and you can have light coming streaming down, as you apply different types of tones in there, leave that area white. And anyways, that's the basic concept of that. So kind of a little bit more of a free form. And it's not haphazard. It's not stacking up these things and going from one impression and then going to the next, impression, changing the angle at a 90-degree angle, but just generally overlapping slightly, change the angle from one another, and you won't be able to see kind of the edges and where one impression, ends and the other one begins. Okay. Now, let's see here. Let's go back to that grass stamp right there and show you some other applications of that. This is the Sedge cluster stamp. It's kind of like creates a little bit of a bank right there, overlapping, changing the height of it a little bit. Okay, taking the Sedge filler stamp. That was the one that was used in here. Creating these little hills maybe in the background with that. Okay, here's a tree cluster stamp. I don't need to do any masking. Got some large trees here. Planting them down. Okay. Here's my soft mask. That's as much as I need to do on here. No careful masking. And again, going back to the concept of really making your stamps go far as the usage of them goes. I'm masking off some of this grass right here. Taking the same tree cluster stamp, masking off some of that grass in there and kind of creating a little bit of a hill. And I'm using the tops of these trees going back in the distance. If this little hill right here is a little bit closer to us and this one right back here is farther away, why not use just a little bit of a tip portion of this tree and create some background trees in there. And again, I'm going with this reed stamp right here. Why not create a little bit of foreground? I think that it's nice creating that extra depth. Suddenly we've added something that's a couple feet away from us, and we go way back in the distance there. And I don't know, how about some birds? This is the gull stamp right here. And I don't know, let's see. There's a little bit of a tree duo. If you want to kind of mix up the textures in here a little bit more, why not have some other trees in here? Just for some variation, wherever you want it to go, just cover up right there. Alright, and here's this little doe stamp again. Maybe that's some thicker grass right there, taller grass, so you can wipe off more of the legs, like that. Take it, and where to put it? That's always kind of the hardest thing about scene building. Where do you want to put these little tiny details? Alright, so anyways, variations on existing designs used in its entirety right here. Right here it's been used from the top up, way in the background, maybe even using a smaller tip of it. Okay, and hopefully it won't look as though it's the same stamp used over and over and over again. And the grass used in there, on top of a water scene, creating a meadow within there. Clouds, both sides, blended in nice and seamlessly. And again, changing the angle, changing the height of it slightly, and overlapping. And those will give you the best results as far as creating the foundation for a seamless scene. And again, even if you do get some gaps in there, by the time you add in a bunch of these other tones in there, maybe in this one right here it'd be greens for the grass, blues for the water, all of that too will blend everything together even farther. So if you do get this and you start seeing these little gaps and whatnot, you don't need to worry about it because it'll all kind of disappear by the time you add in all of your other tones. Okay, thanks again for watching.